Wow, we are all Africans. Wow, we are all Africans.
What is your full name and what does it mean?
My name is Rebeca Omordia. Rebeca, in fact, it's an inherited name. I was named after my father's sister, older sister that raised him, which was Rebecca Kemesi. Now she's Rebecca Kemesi Ziehi. She was Rebecca Kemesi Omordia. That she had a great influence on my father's life and path. And when I was born, I was named after her. Omordia is my grandfather's name, my father's name. I would have, according to the Nibo tradition, my name would have been my father's forename, Ifaini. So I would have been Rebecca Ifaini. But because I was born in Romania, I had to take the last name of my father as in his passport. My name is Rebecca Omordia.
So you talked about Igbo culture and you talked about Romania. So I guess that you have, I would say, a dual identity, but actually I'm sure that it's even more than dual and multiple identities. And so I would like to hear from you about your upbringing. What did it look like?
I was born in Romania and I was raised in Romania, but I think as a presentation, I would say, as a general presentation, my artistic identity is rooted in Nigeria, in my father's country. I worked in Nigeria a lot, extensively. I toured Nigeria, performed in Lagos, Abuja, and this also aligns with my main goal of bringing Nigerian art music and African classical music to global audiences. But going back to my upbringing and where I come from, I was raised in Romania. It was, in fact, under the communist regime. It was Ceausescu's communist regime, where I benefited from a very strict musical upbringing. In Romania, music education was free. In fact, it still is, and wasn't for the elite. It was part of every day. Everyone had access to it. Of course, to become a professional musician, you had to enter a specialist music school for specially talented children, which I did. It wasn't something that my parents had envisioned for me, but it was something that I chose. I wanted to be a pianist, and as a result, I informed them about that. And of course, being raised by a Nigerian father and with a strong Nigerian mentality, very patriarchal, where you must become, the classical doctor or engineer or lawyer. This was not something that he thought I should pursue, but because I was very committed to playing the piano, to practicing for long hours, because learning the piano in that tradition, it's something that requires discipline, requires years. It's a slow process, but it's very difficult and requires a lot of persistence, which I had because I loved to be on the stage and I loved to play the piano. And so I developed this I became a pianist within the Romanian musical tradition. Later, I moved to the UK, to England, where I've been here for 20 years now. This gradually changed. This is where it was a new environment, it was a different culture. Suddenly, things that for me were, even the values had changed. It was a diverse environment where I started wondering, while I had African identity in my life, I could not see this on the concert stage. I could not see this in the performance space. And the most decisive moment was when I started investigating to see if there's any Nigerian classical music. Are there any Nigerian composers? And while discovering these schools of Nigerian art music and hundreds of Nigerian composers and discovering this African identity in the piano playing, gradually aligned with what I have known as an African identity as more as a, I would say, as a form of life, not necessarily as an artistic form.
talked about growing up loving playing the piano, being on stage, learning the rigorous and very disciplined practice to get better and better. And I was wondering, when you were growing up and you were playing the piano, what type of music were you listening to at the same time? What other artistic expressions were nourishing you?
I was listening to everything from Nigerian music, Igbo traditional songs that my father himself used to sing, to rock music, because this is something that I was exposed to at the time, a lot of Guns N' Roses, Metallica. I was attending a music school that, in fact, it was an art school that had different departments for music and art. So I was very good friends with artists. Sometimes I would sit in their studios and they would pay me. And they were avid listeners to rock music. And of course, at the same time, Western classical music was such a prominent part of my life that this was something that was part of my everyday listening cultures. And the European composers were part, and the standard European canon was part of my training and of my regular upbringing. So I had access to quite a diverse range of musics at the time, but because of how the Western tradition is that becoming a concert pianist, you have to play and listen to what it's called in Europe the serious music, which is the European music. And at the time, as a child, this was something that had priority over anything else. Of course, my grandfather had been a traditional musician. He used to play the Nibo flute, and my father used to tell me so much about that. But for me, this was more of, again, part of my African identity in life, but not as African identity as a pianist, because that at the time didn't exist.
I would like you to explain to us who don't know much about music what classical means and what is it that you've learned when you've discovered all these other artists.
Classical as a Western classical music. This is a form developed by European musical societies, composers over many, many centuries that had written in certain classical forms, the piano sonata, the counterpoint pieces, orchestral works, what we know as European orchestras. So this was known as Western classical music. While coming to the UK, I was exposed to a wide range of cultures, musical traditions, and when I started investigating the Nigerian composers, of course, because a lot of this music had never been published or it was out of print. I was quite fortunate at the time that this is when social media had really taken a toll on young people's lives, and I was able to connect through the social media platform with most of these composers. And in fact, I reached one of the first pianists that had recorded some of this music was a pianist from Ghana, William Chapam Nyaho. And I wrote to him and I told him I'm interested in this music and where I could find some of these composers and the scores. And I remember he took a video at the time. I didn't have an account on Facebook. I wasn't into social media. I didn't think it was relevant. From my own friends, most of them, they were posting images from their day-to-day life. It had no meaning to me. But this pianist, he found a video on YouTube of me performing with an orchestra in Romania, a very virtuosic piece, and he shared it on his own platform where his followers were fellow African musicians. And he said, look at this pianist, she's Nigerian and she's looking for Nigerian piano music. And then suddenly I see this huge influx of emails from Nigerian musicians, Nigerian composers sending me music, piano works, piano scores. And suddenly there's a brand new world opening onto me.
That's fascinating that it's through social media that in your mind was completely irrelevant because of what you saw and the use of, let's say, regular people, but also the way it connected you to archives and things that were available but not available to you where you were, but it existed. So that connection. And so when you connected with them, I'm so excited about just what you said. Like he posted the video, ask, and then you receive all these emails. What were the conversations about? And what type of collaboration or what were you talking about?
My main goal was just to find piano scores and see exactly how did these composers write. Is that music of any value, because at the time I still had this mentality that classical music must be serious, must be virtuosic, must be written in a certain style to fit a certain audience. Because the video that my friend had posted on social media was showing me as a very virtuosic pianist with a very big technique. Of course, all the Nigerian and African composers thought, well, she's equipped with the right tools to play this music. I didn't understand much of what this meant at that time, but that's how I became available to be able to receive all this music. One of the composers that I managed to reach out to and be connected with was Fred Onowolosoke, who he's from Ghana, from Nigerian parents. Well, belongs to both countries, Nigeria and Ghana, but he's based in the United States. And in 2013, 2012, I think he had a festival, African and Afro-American Music Festival. And I started learning some of his 24 studies in African rhythms, and he invited me to perform some of this repertoire at his festival in St. Louis. And of course, this was an incredible opportunity for me to perform African music for the first time and to be connected with them. And of course, I said yes, and I went and I played there. I learned the music, which was quite difficult to learn. And when I got there, I remember that he helped me understand this music from an African perspective. And that's how my journey began into exploring this repertoire.
You said that it was difficult for you to learn and then he helped you understand it. What does that mean and how does it feel? Did you have to unlearn some patterns and create new ones, or what were you negotiating?
It was more of a process of transformation. I was not unlearning, I was not changing anything, but I'd known. It was transforming. This is, in fact, the moment where my European training with my African identity aligned and became one and made space for what really became an Africanism in my artistic development. And it was revelatory, and at the same time, it felt like home for me because, until then, being raised in a European country, even though I had parents from both cultures, European and African, while growing up, I didn't see myself different to anyone around me because I was trained to be a pianist. So why should I be different if we all practiced 7 hours a day and then we went to perform after years of training? But I was made known surely by the media, by the competition adjudicators, by my colleagues that actually I didn't necessarily belong in that space. And it was always a struggle to belong, which is actually usually is the struggle of most Africans in the diaspora. But in fact, we do not need, I learned later that we do not need to search to belong because we already belong. We are where we come from. And so when learning this music, the composer, which coincidentally he even comes from the Delta state, he's Urobo, but he's from Delta state, same region, same state where my father is from. And he was singing to me, he was tapping some rhythms to try to bring this aspect of this Africanness into my playing. And gradually I started feeling it. That there were a lot of places where the music seemed so difficult to understand because I had just learned it with the score. I was reading it from a European's perspective because it had a European notation. But with African music, African art music, this goes beyond the score. I think, in one of the notes you wrote to me before this podcast, we're talking about an African memory. This is what it is, which is between what's in the score and what we play. is there's a space where you really have to find your identity, and this is really rooted into your gene, and you cannot fight it regardless of your upbringing, regardless of your education or where you live. This is in you, it's in your blood. And of course, the fact that my grandfather had been a traditional musician, then it became really more evident in who I was. It wasn't something that was exotic as part of my lineage. It was something that I could align with. And suddenly it changed me. And it changed me as an artist and as a pianist.
Yeah, that's very powerful, especially when you talk about the fact that when you had this transformation, you also felt home, and you also talked about memory and about, all the thing about feeling I don't belong, because somehow there is a feeling of being uprooted and now completely being grounded, because there is a sort of language that is beyond the things that were presented to you, but that you can bring in. So from what I hear is that you sort of have all the ingredients with the very rigorous training that you had, and the culture of music in Romania, the fact that it was very open to everybody. And then the other ingredient of your family, that is actually your grandfather is a musician, your father was singing some songs to you, the classical music, rock, everything that you have, right? All the influences. And then taking all this and realizing that there is also African classical music, and it's another level of all these things, and that you can be an agent and also participate in it. So I've seen also that education plays a major role in your work, and I would like to know why it's important for you to teach and curate this music.
Yes, I think this is a major part of my work, because until recently, well, until I started the African concert series, there was no space for African classical music. In fact, through my discovery of this repertoire and to bringing it to a concert hall, African composers are not bare imitators of European traditions. They are authors, because they bring through Western classical forms like the piano sonata or etudes or counterpoint, they bring the African musical language, they bring the African history, they bring the African memory. It's very important to educate the Western audiences, because this is where we activate about the abundance of work created by African composers, about the diversity of the African music repertoire, which is reflected in the such diverse regions of the African continent. Composers that also had a similar journey as mine, through the migration, through their contact with European culture, which it's not a result of colonialism, it's a I will say it's a way of how they transformed the experiences to bring their own history and to bring their own culture through a global language, which is African art music.
Well, you're all African in a world that keeps asking us to prove we belong. Being grounded is a radical act.
What do you notice when students or audiences encounter African classical composer for the first time?
For audiences, especially the Western audiences, they have this reaction: "Oh wow, I didn't know there was so much music there. Oh wow, I didn't know there were so many composers. Wow, this is fascinating. Like, oh wow, we discovered Africa." To put it here ironically, but at the same time, I've been really blessed to have such a receptive audience, because I benefited from incredible support from the Wigmore Hall that's hosting the African Concert Series, and it's helping us reach the audience, the classical audience, the European audience, as well as bringing together the African audience that is interested in this music and that knows this music. But at the same time, from an educator point of view, I think it's so interesting and so important to educate young people about African culture and through its music. First of all, because This way they discover African culture without necessarily having to go in through the, the history of it that now is being written accurately. And at the same time, from musicians' point of view, they realize that a lot of even of the European music has quite a lot of African memory in it that before was, that now is being reclaimed. If we're looking at the African diaspora composers that activated at the same time with European composers, their voices were unheard. They were not allowed into the canon. Let's just take example a composer Joseph Bologne, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, that worked at the same time with Mozart. And it's arguably or unarguably, he wrote music almost identical to Mozart. But who was first? Why did we not know about him? Why we're just discovering that? And why is it so unfairly being described as the black Mozart? Why wouldn't have Mozart been described the white Chevalier de Saint Georges? So, these are topics that I think are worth debating. But at the same time, for young people, it opens up their world to understand the history of the African people, the history of Africa. At the same time, from pianist's perspective, once you learn music in an African pianism style, you never see even European music in the same way anymore. The rhythm has a completely different pulse, has life. The melodic lines, they sing, they're not just, some neutral melodies that composers created. They come with history, they come with stories. And once you get that, you assimilate that in your playing, it changes the way you see piano, it changes the way you see music altogether.
There is something that you said when we started the conversation about the fact that you're very often in Nigeria. And I could see also that this year you're going to be in Africa. In a lot of places, you were in South Africa as well. So, how about African audiences? Because I think, except from people who are very knowledgeable, maybe also a lot of Africans do not know all these composers. So, what is the reception and how is the reception and the feedback that you get?
I think African art composers are still yet to be discovered even in Africa. And this, I think it depends on the responsibility of the universities and all the cultural organizations, because these African composers, they belong to the African history as well, not just to bring it to the European history. And this is work in progress. Until recently, African art music was only accessible to the elite in Africa, because traditional music, which is also African classical music, but the traditional music, this is part of people's everyday lives. But we are talking about a huge number of African art music composers that activated both in Africa and in Europe and belong to be received in their homeland with the right acknowledgement. And then I think, this is something that I have been working with universities, for instance, in South Africa, where because of their history and because of their apartheid history, most of the composers there have composed in European style. And we don't even know many Black South African composers, just a few. But gradually now, after my visit in South Africa last year, I've been working with composers to develop a South African pianism repertoire. And this is something that we are bringing gradually now to audiences. In Nigeria, there are universities that they are discussing African art music, Nigerian art music. There are bigger universities, there are bigger cultural organizations that sometimes still prefer to program European music, because that's for the elite, and the elite believe that classical music of great value is European, but that still audiences need to be educated for their own value. And I believe with education also comes empowerment. And I think this is what Africa needs at the moment, to value its own people.
Yeah, and value its own people, its own creativity, and as you said, its own heritage, because that's also
Exactly.
what this carries. What does being African mean to you?
Being African, such a complex question, because there's my being African as an artist, there's my being African as a woman, which are completely different aspects of my life. And I have assumed both roles. It's in Africa, or in Nigeria, it's impossible to be an African woman without all the responsibility that comes with it. And I have happily embraced that role. Being African as a musician, it reflects in my playing. Now, most of my programs that I perform are African pianism. Before, about 10, 15 years ago, I used to beg concert organizers to allow me to include an African composer in the program or at the end of the program just to show it to the audiences. But now I'm invited to perform only African pianism repertoire, which is, I think it's revolutionary, and I'm grateful and blessed for this opportunity. But at the same time, I think really being African for me, it shows mostly when I'm on the stage, because really that's for me, it's the most sacred moment. Also, my reason for becoming a pianist was to play on stage. So I always believed, this is where you really align with your energy, your ancestors, your everything, the world suddenly makes sense. And playing African music on stage has revealed so many aspects of what it means to be African. And I'll give an example. For instance, I was performing some time ago music by a Nigerian composer, Igbo composer, Cristiano Nieji. It's a Igbo dance for piano, which is inspired by Igbo Ufie percussion ensembles in southeastern Nigeria. And the piano gradually starts assuming this percussive role, but it's not by just playing the percussive on one place or one register of the piano. It's by assuming a percussion ensemble role. And I remember I was playing this in a concert, and suddenly I feel myself outside the piano. I can see myself outside the piano playing all these instruments, and I don't realize it's the piano anymore. I'm really outside of my body, and it's a whole movement of physical movement and that of the spirit. So that's when it all made sense to me, and that's when I can say I am truly an African.
Wow, it's a form of trance that
Exactly.
you go into it and you go into more than just music, but I think it's never just music, but you go into the spirit, you go into form, you go into your essence, which is profound. And I believe that, especially since you've had this passion for so long, and also based on what you told me, so your father was not really like not too keen on you pursuing this, but I would love to know how do how does it feel now that you've embraced this and you're educating and you are really pushing African pianism? What do your parents think about it now?
I like to believe that they're very proud of me. And if they're not, I am proud myself. Yes, yes, exactly. And, I think from the perspective of even though I was raised in, let's say, in Europe, I was raised with the mentality of an African woman, where the role of a woman in Africa it's quite determined from the moment you are born. You need to have a special path in your life. And I remember in the beginning, for me, it was always a struggle of finding myself. Yes, I always wanted to play the piano, but it was always a struggle. It was always a struggle of who I am, what do I want to do, or who do I want to actually it was more about who do I want to be. And once I was allowed, this is more about being allowed to perform this music as part of my real artistic identity, I can say this is who I am. This is when I have arrived. It doesn't matter I am performing this on big stages, famous concert halls in the world, or within a small community. The music is the same and the message is the same. If we remember that in Africa, music was performed before in ancestral times for special purposes, was for ceremonial purposes, for rituals, for healing dances. And while playing this music, we're reconnecting to who our ancestors were and who we are, really. And I think it's very important for me as a human being, as an artist, and also for the audiences that are part of this. I would say it's my gospel. So they're part of this process.
You talked about the role as a woman and as an African woman. What did you feel that you were assigned to? And do you think that you've disrupted these roles, or you managed to embrace those, or you created your own roles?
I've transformed them and also created them, created new roles. Even when I was a child, I was never a regular child. And my parents, initially, they found this as almost as it was disruptive to their lives to have such a child that has so much energy, to have a child that has, from such a young age, a mind of its own, that refuses to accept things that don't align with what he wants. They want. I think by doing, my mother always used to say that, yes, you've always done in life what you wanted to do. Because every time I did, in fact, the truth is that way, because every time I did something that I didn't believe in, it never worked out right for either parties. That's why eventually my parents allowed me to just find my own journey, regardless of how difficult that was. Because for me, that was my main purpose, to just follow my truth. And as an African woman, now there are so many African women that are inspiring, and they've assumed maybe traditional roles, that of wife, mother. But in fact, the role of a mother is to create something. And if a woman can create life, then she can also create the life that she wants. So and that's something that I have assumed. And of course, I'm also an established auntie in Africa. This is something that carries weight and responsibility. And I try my best.
You beautifully said that if a woman can create life, she can create her own life. I think I've never seen it this way, maybe, but it's really telling because it is true. There are some assigned roles, but there is the reality of also what you create by being, by transforming, by sharing, teaching, learning, and that's also how you said that, by being inspired and inspiring people without even knowing, right? Because even as an auntie, there is a lot of inspiration that happens without even knowing. Because you're not really the direct educator, but you're still there, and there is another option here. And so, yeah, beautifully said. I have this question that I really want to ask. So, what would a future look like where African classical music is no longer framed as niche or rediscovered, but really simply as known? What would it look like?
Well, it's already starting to look like it. And, I'm really blessed that I'm alive to see this. Yes, it's required a lot of sacrifices and a lot of persistence, but this is incredible for me to be able to witness this. And now, so many young people that are looking for this repertoire. So many concert halls are programming this music. The African Concert Series is already in its 8th season, which, yes, I'm so grateful to Wigmore Hall for providing us with this, with the means to make this happen. And it's gradually now a lot of the exam boards, such as the ABRSM, which is the Associated Boards of Royal Schools of Music, they're including in their syllabus music by African composers. And gradually and rapidly, the African composers are starting to be recognized as authors in their own right.
So I know that you're very humble, but the reality here is that your work is pretty radical and you're really a pioneer in what you're doing. So it's really happening because there are people like you are also making it happen. And I would like to thank you for that. Because by going through your website, watching all the videos on YouTube, I've learned so much. I really felt like my body, my mind was opening to new things that I kind of knew existed, but didn't know that it was just here, palpable. So thank you for that. But also, there is this part where I saw that there were some composers and some singers who were also from the Caribbean. And so this meeting of really Africa and diaspora was explosive when I was just there, and I I had chills. How do you see yourself in these bridges, and what do you like to see more in the future?
I've always said that you are the language you speak changes who you are. So, for instance, when I speak Romanian, I become Romanian because I grew up in Romania. Even though if I speak Romanian to Romanians that don't know me, they have the impression they don't understand what I'm saying. Really? Or they say, "Oh, you've learned it so well," but actually, no, you're not Romanian. But with friends or with friends I grew up with, we speak, we understand each other. And I'm not saying we understand each other's words, we understand the meaning behind those words. In Nigeria, the same. If I'm with Nigerians, when we speak, they will say, "Oh, so you're an Igbo girl," even though sadly my Igbo is still in it. So,
Needs more practice? Yeah.
yes, exactly. But because I know the culture so well. And in that way, I think I am from everywhere. Also, living in England, this has really changed my way of seeing the world. And I also understand these words very well now, and it's predictable to me. So, what I would like to see in the future, regarding identity, it's more about, talking about the African diaspora and talking about Africa. Why do we need to separate it? Yes, there is a history there. Yes, but we should no longer be defined by the history. In the end, we are all Africans. And exactly, I guess, as your podcast so well puts it out there, we are all Africans. And that's why I find it really inspiring when I work now with musicians of what it's called from the African diaspora. That before, they would be described as Black musicians. So there's African musicians and there's Black musicians. But what's the difference? They're all Africans, and they all realize that the moment they start playing this music, they find themselves in it, regardless of where they were born or where their ancestries, or if that is even accurate, or where, we live. We are all Africans. And I think, African classical music is the real medium of making this clear and available to everyone there that is described as of African heritage.
What do you love most about being African?
Um, it's a freedom, and I think in Africa there's a freedom. It's a freedom of who you are. Of course, there's now this very strong, in Nigeria, there's a strong tribalism. But this, I believe, it's something that it's more politically instilled, because there's a freedom in being African, because there's a freedom of thinking. There's something that if you really look deep down the roots of what means, of your own, let's say, of your own ethnic group or your own tribe, there's a freedom. They never had all these closed institutions of where, you're allowed to be only in a certain way. For me, being African now, of course, this freedom really reflects in my playing the African music. And that's where it's also fascinating when I work with African traditional musicians. And that's something, a recent project where I have blended or have joined the European musicians with the African musicians, and y- to really experience that freedom. That music is really rooted in you. It's not something that you have to pre-learn and then produce. It comes with, it's in your being. So if music is rooted inside us as Africans, then there's also lots of other values, and there's a knowledge that is beyond what we are being told we are. And that's what I really love about being African. Of course, there's the food and there's the clothes and there's the heat, which my retirement, this is where you'll find me. But on maybe a beach in Nigeria, but that's what I love about being African.